Sometime in the winter of 52 or 53 AD, the Apostle Paul wrote from Macedonia the book of 2 Corinthians. And in the book of 2 Corinthians, Paul deals with a lot of issues. He deals with the false teachers that were plaguing the good church, or the church at Corinth. And in the course of this, he also refers back to something that he said in the book of 1 Corinthians, and that is concerning the brother that was involved in sin. You may recall in 1 Corinthians chapter 5, there was a brother there that was involved in fornication. He had his father's wife, and Paul was calling upon the church to do something about that. And as he writes 2 Corinthians, then of course we see that something indeed was done about that, and he praises the church for that, and obviously it seems that the brother was even restored to the Lord. And then as the book draws to a close, in 2 Corinthians chapter 12, as the young brother read in our hearing this morning, Paul deals with an issue that is kind of interesting, and I hope you think it's interesting as well. I believe he's writing in the third person, and I think he's actually referring to himself when he talks about a man that had been caught up into the third heaven. And the man that was caught up in the third heaven, Paul didn't know whether in the body or out of the body, in the spirit or how, but he was telling that this man had seen something that was not permitted for him to see. I want you to think about that. I think, again, Paul is referring to himself. He was the one that was caught up into the third heaven. He was the one that saw things that were just not permitted for him to reveal. And I just think of just how this would change you. Just think a little bit about how that you would feel so honored by being able to be caught up and observe these things. But Paul said, rather than being honored for this event, that something happened. Paul said that rather than being able to, boast or being able to exalt himself, he says, what happened was a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan to buffet me. Now I want you to think about that just a little bit. Paul said, a thorn in the flesh was given to me. And he said the purpose of this thorn in the flesh was to keep me from boasting, to keep me from being exalted for what had happened and what I had been able to observe. Now, a thorn in the flesh, now, I want you to think about this. He's not talking about a literal briar or thorn being in his flesh. He's using a figure of speech here. Now, we know that, we understand that, because we use figures of speech very similar to that. We'll talk about something being a pain in the neck. Well, we don't really have a pain in the neck, but there's something that is annoying us. There's something that's causing us to be, annoyed or upset. Or we'll talk about, a thorn in my side. Well, that really is a thorn in my side, we may say, in certain times. Even in the Old Testament, God uses this analogy just a little bit when he tells the Hebrews that unless you have eradicated the idolatry from the land, he said, well, I tell you what, those that you let remain, Numbers 33 and verse 55, shall be irritants in your eyes, and he said, there'll be thorns in your side. So he's using a figure of speech. He said, I have been given a thorn in the flesh. Now, what we usually do when we think about that is we begin to, what is it? We wonder, what was Paul's thorn in the flesh? He said he had one. And again, he's using a figure of speech here, so he's not talking about a literal briar or thorn that has penetrated his skin. Well, was it physical? Perhaps. It was, there's been a lot of speculation about that. Some commentators and so-called scholars say, well, Paul had chronic malaria, migraine headaches, epilepsy, a speech impediment. Or most people say, well, if it was physical, it's probably poor eyesight. Was it? I don't know. We aren't told. It could have been. Or it could have been something that is emotional. He said in 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 28, what comes upon me daily, my deep concern for all of the churches. And that would cause an annoyance. And was it emotional? Maybe. I don't know. Was it physical? Perhaps. We are not told. Others have suggested that it was adversarial, that it was the persecution that he underwent, the shipwrecks, the being stoned, being in perils of his brethren and of being in perils of countrymen. Was it those things that were an annoyance to him? Maybe. And again, we're not told. Or it could have been something as simple as discouragement. He could have been discouraged at the condition of the churches, discouraged at what he was undergoing. He said, we despaired in 2 Corinthians 1 and verse 8, even of life itself. So we may not be told what the thorn in the flesh was, and that raises a lot of interesting speculations, but really it shouldn't be of any concern to us what that thorn in the flesh was. But what we do know that the thorn in the flesh had a purpose. And that thorn in the flesh was to buffet Paul. He said, a thorn in the flesh was given to me, a messenger of Satan, he said, to buffet me. And something else that we know, when you think about buffeting, we're just talking about a continual source of torment. But something else that we know about this. Paul said that this thorn in the flesh that was sent to buffet him, whatever it was, physical, emotional, adversarial, or discouraging, whatever it was, Paul said it's a result of the devil. He said this was a messenger that was sent to me by Satan. It was a thorn in the flesh. It was given to me. It was a messenger of Satan. Now, I want us to just stop and focus upon that just a little bit. That's not going to be the focus of our study, but just at this point, at this moment in time. You know, a lot of people in our culture today, seems like that the idea, the belief in Satan is something that is archaic. It is something that we maybe don't talk about very much because it might embarrass us a little bit to think about a belief in a being known as Satan or the devil. But if we're going to believe in the scriptures that refer to God and refer to Jesus and the Holy Spirit and reveal to us the words of God, then we're going to have to believe in the being called Satan, because the same Bible that talks about God talks about Satan. And Paul says that Satan is the source of this thorn in the flesh. Now, to the Corinthians, in 2 Corinthians chapter 11, Paul makes it clear in verse 14 that to the Corinthians the devil was an angel of light. But Paul says, really, the devil is an angel of agony. Because I'm going to tell you, the devil is the source of all suffering. We've got to understand that. And suffering, I believe, the Bible teaches, is the corridor into the heart of every believer. When we begin to suffer, a corridor is opened up that allows certain things to come in that challenge our faith, that challenge our commitment to God. But what we need to also recognize is that the devil is a liar. A devil is a liar from the beginning. He is the father of lies, and so as a result of that, any message, and remember, this thorn in the flesh was a messenger from Satan, but any message from the devil is a lie. And we know that, because the devil is, in fact, a liar, and has been go back to Genesis 3, from the very beginning, when he told Eve, you shall not surely die if you eat from the fruit of this tree. Now, let's pause and make some observations here that we all ought to make at this point in our study. Like the Apostle Paul, we need not think, ladies and gentlemen, that we're going to go through life without difficulties. I think sometimes we have the mistaken notion that if I become a Christian, if I devote my life to serving God, somehow that's going to inoculate me from the problems and the issues and the diseases and the things of this life. No, let me tell you something. Being a Christian is not going to immunize you from problems. It's not going to put a circle or a hedge about you that's going to ensure that everything in your life is going to just come up roses and everything is going to be fine. Our Lord said, you may recall, in John 16 and verse 33, He said, in this world you will have tribulation. He didn't say that chances are that you will. He didn't say that maybe, perhaps you will. He said, in this world you will have tribulation. And the Apostle Peter, in 1 Peter 4 and verse 12, he said, listen, do not be surprised when fiery trials come upon you. And these will come upon you to test your faith. Now let's just stop and think about that. How many of us really were prepared for what happened when COVID-19 hit the world? We weren't prepared for that. And we had no idea that something that traumatic and something that bizarre could even happen. But you add to that all of the other things that we experience in life. Sicknesses and troubles at home. You know, we have sicknesses that we have to deal with. And there are hearts that need to be melted. There are, homes that need to be healed. No question about that. Problems needing to be solved. And so these are things that we're going to deal with on a regular basis. And I want you to remember, when these things happen, whatever they are, they're not from God. They're from Satan. And we need to recognize and understand that. Does God permit? Yes, God permits this to occur. There's any question about that. God is sovereign. God is all-powerful. But God permits these things to happen, and these are messengers of Satan. Satan is the origin of these. Remember in the parable of the tares that Jesus gives in Matthew chapter 13, and, he said in verse 38, I believe, he said, the enemy has done this. Satan has done this. Satan has sown these tares. And so that's the way that it is in life. All of these problems that we experience, all of these heartaches that we have, it's a result of the devil. It's the result of Satan. It's a result of this angel of agony. Now, what did Paul do when this happened? When he received this thorn in the flesh, how is it Paul responded to this? He responded to it just exactly like you and I would. He said, concerning this thing, I pleaded with the Lord 3 times that it may depart from me. Now let's stop and just focus upon that just a little bit. What he did, what he said was, I went to God. I prayed about this thing. Now, why he limits this to 3, I don't know. But he said, I prayed about it. I pleaded with the Lord 3 times. Now, was that 3 times in rapid succession? Or was it 3 times over this period of 14 years? He said it had been 14 years since you'd caught up into heaven. And again, we don't know. But we do know that Paul prayed about this. And what happened? How did God respond to that? Paul's a good man. Paul's a godly man. Paul's an apostle of the Lord. And Paul had his thorn in the flesh. And Paul prayed to God 3 times that it be removed. And I'll tell you what God did. God said no. God said, I'm not going to remove it. And so whatever it was going to remain for the rest of the Apostle Paul's life. God said, I'm not going to remove it. But what God did say is that my grace is sufficient for you. And after God said that to Paul, it seems, my friends, that a sense of finality settled in the heart of Paul. And God said, my grace is sufficient for you. And he said, my strength is made perfect in weakness, also in verse 9 of 2 Corinthians 12. And so what did Paul conclude from that? He said, therefore, most assuredly, or most gladly, I will rather boast in my infirmities that the power of Christ may rest upon me. I'm okay with it. I asked God to remove it, and God said no. And you know what? I'm okay with that. Did he want it removed? Yes. Was it something that he delighted that he had? No. But I'll tell you what, he said, I can live with this. I'm okay with this. He said, I take pleasure in infirmities and reproaches and needs and persecutions and distresses for Christ's sake. For when I am weak, then am I strong. What he's saying is, in this beaten down condition, when I am in this weakened state as a result of this thorn in the flesh, he said, I'm relying upon he who has strength. I'm relying upon the Lord. For when I am weak, then I am strong, not on his own, but of his commitment to the Lord. Now, I want us to unpack this just a little bit, if we might. Because that's an interesting phrase. My grace is sufficient. You know, in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, the Apostle Paul makes the point, does he not? And I think about verse 12. He said, I am what I am by the grace of God. I love that. No matter what it is, Paul said, I am what I am by the grace of God. Now, in that context, he's not a whip behind the chief apostle. I get that. The Apostle Paul writes in Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9, that speaking of Christians, we're saved by faith, saved by grace through faith. Saved by grace through faith. That not of yourselves, it's the gift of God, not of works, lest anyone should boast. And then he goes on to say, but that doesn't mean there's not things to do, because we're his workmanship created in Christ Jesus. But the point that I want us to see is, Paul said we're saved by grace. Now you think about this as it applies to Paul. Here was Paul, prior to his conversion, Saul of Tarsus, breathing threats and murders against the disciples. The grace of God. Remember, I am what I am by the grace of God. The grace of God was able to take an assassin, and that's what he was, a religious terrorist, but the grace of God was able to take an assassin and make him into an apostle. The grace of God was able to take a persecutor and make him into a preacher. Take a sinner and make him into a saint. And if the grace of God has that much power, if the grace of God has that much life-changing power in it, there is any wonder that he can say, no matter what he's facing in this life, no matter what he's going through, the grace of God will see me through this. My grace is sufficient for you. It was sufficient to save you. It was sufficient to change you. And it will be sufficient to carry you through whatever it is that you're going through in this life. And I'll tell you, ladies and gentlemen, I believe with all of my heart, as the older that I get, that this is something that we as God's people need as much as anything. In this life that we're living, in the problems that we're experiencing, and the difficulties that we have to face day to day, we need to recognize that God's grace is sufficient for us. No matter what we're going through, sicknesses, maybe loneliness or family estrangement or even abuses, whatever they may be, we need to have the confidence that the grace of God will carry us through these things. My grace is sufficient for you. We can't do this on our own. We can't hold up on our own. That's why Peter said in 1 Peter 5 and verse 7, cast your care upon him, for he cares for you. And remember, whatever it is that we're going through in this life, the promise that was made to the Apostle Paul is likewise made to us. My grace is sufficient for you. Now, I don't know about you, but my family's been there. And if you haven't, and if your family has not been there, you will be one day when things come upon you and difficulties that have driven you to your knees come upon you and your family. And you cry out to God and you plead with God. Maybe not 3 times, maybe 300 times. Let this cup pass from me. Remove this thorn. Remove these troubles and these heartaches and these problems with my children, with my health, with my family, with life. And God says no. God says you're going to have to bear it. I love you, but I'm not going to remove it. I cherish your relationship, but I'm not going to remove that thorn in the flesh. What do we do then? How do we go on with our lives as Christians when the thorn has not been removed? And this is the reality of it. You know, you listen to some of these televangelists and others who have preached the health and wealth gospel. They make it appear as though everything is going to be great in your life if you become a Christian. No, look at Paul. And look at, maybe even in your own life. I know, like I said, it's in our family. We know that. We understand that. But what do we do when the thorn has not been removed? Do we just throw up our hands and bail on God? Do we just walk away from the faith that we have professed for a number of years? What do we do? I want to offer you some things that I believe are essential in helping us navigate through a life of problems and trials and tribulations when the thorn has not been removed. And the first thing that I would say to you is, right off of the bat, reject the lying message of Satan. Because I'll tell you, when you have these problems and you have tribulations, you have heartaches in your life, maybe it's sickness. Maybe it's the death of a loved one. Maybe it's a family estrangement. Maybe it's betrayal. I remember a number of years ago in a gospel meeting and having a supper with a family. And as an older couple there at the time, Sue and I were much younger. And I just got to asking him about his family. I said, well, tell me a little bit about yourself. What do you have, children? And he began to tell me, and then he started crying. I couldn't understand this. He stopped eating. And he started crying. And he got to telling me about his son. And he said, my son has nothing to do with us, and we don't know why. But he turned his back upon us 30 years ago, and I have grandchildren that I wouldn't recognize if I passed them on the street. This man was heartbroken. He's prayed about this. And yet the problem remains. So when these kinds of things happen, the devil is going to show up because this is a message of Satan, and he's going to fill your heart with lies, and those lies are intended to destroy you. So the first thing you begin to do, you just shut that down. You just reject the lying message of Satan. Somebody said, well, what are you talking about? Okay, it'll go something like this. You begin to entertain thoughts, God has abandoned me. That's a message from Satan. You're going to begin to entertain thoughts that God is unfair to me. This is not right. It's a message of Satan. But it'll be, well, God, I don't understand this. I've been faithful to you all of these years, and this is coming upon me now? Where are you? It's a message of Satan. And so we begin to question our faith, and we begin to question our relationship to God. We need to recognize that all of these are lies of the devil. God is not punishing you. This is not from God. These are lies. And remember, my grace is sufficient for you. And if I remember that, I will reject Satan's lying message. Next, I need to crank up. I need to revive my prayer dependence upon God. Somebody, whoa, wait a minute, JR, that makes no sense. You've already indicated that God has said no, whatever it is that I'm asking Him to remove, and I still have it, and it's still there, and it's still eating at me. And you're telling me to continue to pray? Yes. Yes, I am. You need prayer now more than ever. But you said it didn't do any good. It's a lie of Satan. Again, yes, God is not going to remove it. Whatever it is, you got to deal with it. But it's not a time to break off communication from God. You need, at this time, prayer more than ever. Pray when you don't feel like it. Pray when you think if your prayers are not going any further than the ceiling. You pray. And you continue to pray. Don't stop. And don't stop worshiping God. That's one of the things that the devil wants to convince us of right now. I'll tell you what, I'm just not going to talk to God anymore. Not going to pray. I'm not going to worship. And I'll just stay away. Okay? That's the devil wanting you to be destroyed. That's what he wanted to do with Paul. He wanted to destroy Paul. And Paul said, I'm not going to let it happen. I'm going to rely upon the grace of God. I'll tell you, this is a time to enliven your prayer. This is a time to do what the Apostle Paul said in 1 Thessalonians 5 and verse 17, pray without ceasing. It's not a time to quit. You remember back in 2 Kings chapter 19, we'll not necessarily take the time to read a great illustration of God bringing people through some difficult times. But in 2 Kings 19, Hezekiah, good King Hezekiah, was on the throne. And he was receiving word from the king of Assyria. I'm going to march upon Jerusalem, and I'm going to come into Jerusalem, and I'm going to kill you. I'm going to kill your people. I'm going to gut your children. I am going to utterly destroy Jerusalem. And I'll tell you, Assyria had been on the march, and they had conquered and conquered and conquered and conquered, and now little Judah was in their crosshairs. King Hezekiah received that message. In written form, a letter was given to him. What did he do? What King Hezekiah, I'll tell you what he did. He went to the house of God, and he laid that letter out before God, and he said, God, here it is. Here's what's happening. Here's what's coming upon us. And I can't do anything about it. I'm just going to turn it over to you, and your will be done. And God's will was done. You read that chapter. It's a fantastic chapter. But if you know it, you're going to say, well, God helped and destroyed the Assyrians. I read about that, so God answered that prayer. You know what we need to understand? We need to understand that sometimes God will not calm the storms of life that we're going through. But I'll tell you what He'll do. He'll calm the storm in your heart that will help you get through whatever it is that you're facing. My daughter, my oldest daughter, when she was 25 years old, she was diagnosed with uterine cancer. She was going through all kinds of chemotherapy, and I got to tell you, I don't know all the world there is about that, but I do know that whatever the oncologist was providing for her was not working. So he would change that
And he would tell us, now this has an 80% chance of being successful. And it wasn't. And she was deathly sick. Maybe Mike's family might remember this. And she was down at IU Med Center, downtown Indianapolis. And she was undergoing chemotherapy through an IV. And I was sitting there by her bed, or on her bed by her side, holding her hand. And I knew how sick she was and how sick she was going to be with chemotherapy. And I couldn't take it. I walked out. I walked out into the hallway, and there was a little catwalk going across one of the streets there in Indianapolis. And I just stood there watching the trucks and the cars and the buses go by. And I was crying like any father would cry. And I was praying, and I was praying, and I was praying. And finally, I had no more tears to shed, and I walked back in the room. My daughter took my hand. She said, "Daddy, I don't want you crying anymore." She said, "Because if I get well, I'll go home. And if I don't get well, I'll go home." That calmed the storm in her heart and in mine. Now, God provided a healing. I get that. I thank God for that. She's doing well. But this is what I'm trying to tell you. When you pray and you pray and you pray, it may not remove the thorn, but I'm telling you, it'll calm your heart. Yes, God, I understand that your grace is indeed sufficient for me. And then resist the urge to become bitter. You remember when Job was going through all of his suffering, his wife didn't understand. Job didn't understand. But his wife certainly didn't understand. And in Job 2 and verse 9, she said, "Job, just curse God and die." And I don't know if she was bitter at God. I don't know if she was intending for Job to be bitter at God. And I don't know, maybe she intended for Job to just commit suicide. I don't know. But Job said such a thing as that in verse 10 is foolish. You're talking like a foolish woman. Don't do this. Don't do this. Job recognized in chapter 14 and verse 1 that man who's born of a woman is a few days and full of trouble. This is indeed the case. And so when we go through these things and we're dealing with these things and it just doesn't seem fair to us, chances are we might become bitter and angry at God. God, why did you let this happen to me? I just don't understand God. And a lot of people do get angry with God. Brother L.A. Stouffer, maybe you know him. Preaches out in St. Louis. He and I we did a lot of preachers training courses together and spent a lot of time together. L.A. told me about the time that his first wife died of breast cancer. He said, JR, he said, we thought everything was going well with Shirley, but then he said it came back with a vengeance and said she went downhill quick. And he said, I was in the hospital with her the night that she died. And he said, I prayed and I prayed and I prayed. God would spare her. For me, for the children. She died. And he said, I remember leaving the room. He said, I walked down to the chapel there in the hospital. He said, JR, he said, I went in that chapel, and he said, I got to tell you, I was so angry. I was so angry. But he said, I wasn't angry with God. I was angry at the devil. Look what you have taken from me. Don't be bitter against God. Remember, the enemy has done this. And don't be bitter and angry against others that may not be going through what you are going through. Sometimes it's so tempting to look out and we see other people just seemingly going on with life, and why is this I don't get it. Well, here's somebody that doesn't even go to church. Here's somebody that I'm going to church on Sunday morning and they're out mowing their yard or drinking a beer or going to the beach or whatever it is that they're doing. I don't get it.
And so we become angry, and that's just not right. Why didn't it happen to him? You know, the psalmist addresses this in Psalm 73. He said in verse 12, "Behold, these are the ungodly who are always at ease. They increase in riches. Surely I have cleansed my heart in vain and washed my hands in innocence. For all day long I've been plagued and chastened every morning. If I had said, I will speak thus, behold, I would have been untrue and to the generation of your children. When I thought how to understand this, it was too painful for me." But then there was an epiphany. Until I went into the sanctuary of God, then I understood therein. I got it in focus. I brought it all the way back. Now I understand it may be temporary that you're going through these good times, but I know what's awaiting you. So when these problems begin to happen, you fight, you resist, you overcome the urge to be bitter. And you remember, my grace is sufficient for you. Reestablish. This is important. Reestablish your spiritual relationships. Do not cut yourself off from your brothers and sisters in Christ. Don't do that. We're a family of Christians. We're the people of God. We are the family of God. And when I'm going through something that's difficult, my brothers and my sisters, they want to reach out to me. They want to help me. They want to rejoice with me when things are well, but they want to weep with me when things are not going well in my life. We're members of one another, Paul said in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. So when I'm going through these things and my brothers and my sisters want to reach out to me, reach back. Don't isolate yourself, because that's exactly what the devil wants. The devil wants you to face this alone. Because when you face it all alone, you're more vulnerable. So you reach back to those who are reaching out at you. You know, suffering has a way of, you know, old timers used to say suffering make you bitter or better. And there's a lot of truth in that. I like to look at it as suffering has the ability to make us become sullen, withdrawn, pull into a cave or a hole. Suffering has a way of doing that. But suffering can also have the opposite effect. It can make a servant out of us. And sometimes we think, well, I don't see how that can happen, but tragedy can do that. Tragedy can create within us the heart of a servant if we reach back and we don't isolate ourselves. Listen to how Paul put it, and again in the 2 Corinthians letter. In chapter 1 and verse 3, he said, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, the Father of mercies and God of all comfort, who comforts us in all our tribulation." That what, Paul? That we may be able to comfort those who are in any trouble with the comfort with which we ourselves are comforted of God. A friend of mine, his father, had a massive heart attack and died just before Christmas several years ago. And he and his family, they had to travel down to Tennessee where his dad had lived. And my friend was relating this instance to me. He said, we were at the funeral home. He said, my dad was laid out in the casket here, and he said, I was standing at the foot of Dad's casket. He said the people were coming through, and they were hugging me, and they were shaking my hand, and they were speaking words of comfort to me. And you know, sometimes we're that way. We think we got to have the right words to say to somebody who's suffering. And he said, you know, people were coming through and they were saying some of the kindest things and offering me words of comfort. And he said, I just appreciated that. But then he said,
I saw a man that I grew up with walk through the door. And he walked down to where I was standing, and he never said one word to me. He never shook my hand. But what he did, he said he threw his arm around me. And he pulled me tight to him. And we stood there at the foot of Daddy's casket, and we just cried like babies. And then he turned and walked away. He said that brought me more comfort than any word that was spoken to me, because that man lost his dad 10 days before. He knew what I was going through, and he knew what I needed. And that's the way it is in the family of God. We care. We're there. And we want to help. When the thorn is not removed, reestablish your spiritual relationship with your brothers and sisters in Christ, and don't let the devil isolate you, because that makes you vulnerable. My grace is sufficient for you. And finally, this is a time, and I know it's difficult. This is a time to rely unconditionally upon God. You know, we talk about thy will be done in all things. That's not just something we utter in a prayer to show our bona fides and the sovereignty of God. No. It's a life that we live and a faith that we have and a commitment that we cherish. Thy will be done, O Lord, and I'm going to rely upon you unconditionally no matter what it is. Yes, I get it. My life has been blown to pieces. And it'll never be the same on this earth again. I get that. But it's not a time to bail on God. It's not a time to walk away from God. It's not a time to throw up our hands and quit. It's a time to trust Him. It's a time to believe with all of our heart, mind, and soul that maybe not in this life, but in the next life, God will put the pieces back together. And it'll be even greater and grander than we can possibly begin to imagine in our lives. Remember what Paul said. In Romans chapter 8 and verse 18, he said, "For I consider that the sufferings of this present time are not worthy to be compared with the glory which shall be revealed in us." So lean not on your own understanding, as the proverb writer says, when you're going through these difficult times, but trust in the Lord with all of your heart. You know, the book of Habakkuk, one of the minor prophets, it's a book of faith. As a matter of fact, Habakkuk 2 and verse 4 is quoted 3 times in the New Testament: the just shall live by his faith. And if you ever spend some time in the book of Habakkuk, you get a feel of faith and what it looks like. And how that we, no matter what we're going through, we could always rely upon God unconditionally. Habakkuk concludes this way in Habakkuk 3. He said, "Though the fig tree may not blossom, nor fruit be on the vines, though the labor of the olive may fail, and the fields yield no food, though the flock may be cut off from the fold, and there be no herd in the stalls." Let me tell you what he's saying there. He says, "Look, I just lost everything. I just lost everything in life. And even though this happens, yet I will rejoice in the Lord. I will joy in the God of my salvation." And in the words of the Apostle Paul, or was given to the Apostle Paul, "My grace is sufficient for you." That, ladies and gentlemen, is the faith of a man or a woman of God. Because of suffering, we all can become vulnerable to the lies of Satan. And the one thing that Satan wants to happen in our lives is for us to be isolated, separated, cut off from God. Not just now, but throughout all eternity. So cast your care upon him, because indeed God cares